And welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to impose new sanctions on the DPRK by banning its key exports. All the parties involved are currently at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Manila. Can they bring the DPRK to the negotiating table? Donald Trump has recently tweeted that China has done nothing to defuse the DPRK nuclear threat and even threatened to impose tariff hikes. How will China and U.S. ties develop when the American side mixes politics with trade? Let's go to our top story today. The United Nations Security Council has unanimously approved additional sanctions against the DPRK. It comes as foreign ministers and delegations from the ASEAN and its partner states gathered in Manila for the 50th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. The ASEAN Foreign Ministers issued a one-page statement as well, expressing grave concerns over the escalation of tensions in the Korean Peninsula, including the DPRK's most recent ICBM tests, previously launches, and two nuclear tests in the year 2016. They urged Pyongyang to fully comply with its obligations under all relevant UN Security Council resolutions.
Tensions on the Korean Peninsula escalating. The ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting is now in full swing in the Philippine capital, Manila. One of the topics under the spotlight during the meeting is the regional security concerns over the DPRK nuclear issue.
Well, the best signal that North Korea could give us that they're prepared to talk would be to stop these missile launches. We've not had an extended period of time where they have not taken some type of provocative action by launching ballistic missiles. So I think that would be the first and strongest signal they could send to us, is just stop these missile launches.
On Saturday, the UN Security Council unanimously approved tough new sanctions to punish Pyongyang for its escalating nuclear and missile programs. The U.S. proposed resolution aims to eliminate $1 billion from the DPRK export revenues. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi made the remarks after meeting with the DPRK Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho in Manila.
Sanctions are needed, but it's not the ultimate goal. The goal is to pull the nuclear issue back to the negotiating table and seek the way out through talks until denuclearization and peace are achieved on the peninsula.
The foreign minister of the DPRK, Ri Yong-ho, met with his counterpart from South Korea, Kang Kyung-hwa. Kang urged Ri to accept Seoul's offer for military talks to lower tensions on the divided peninsula and discussions regarding a new round of reunions for divided families. However, Ri said that Seoul's proposals to improve ties lack sincerity, given U.S. President Donald Trump and South Korean President Moon Jae-in agreed that the DPRK poses a grave and growing threat in a phone call on Sunday night. Trump tweeted, "Just completed call with President Moon of South Korea. Very happy and impressed with 15-0 United Nations vote on North Korea sanctions." While the new sanctions have now been cleared, diplomats concede it will be some time before their impact is felt by Pyongyang. Whether the situation could be reversed is still worth a look.
So can the new wave of UN sanctions against the DPRK work? In other words, can they really help with the process of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula? With us in here in Beijing, Mr. Zhao Tong, who is an associate in the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome. In Seoul, we are joined by Mr. Sun Young Lee, who is a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Jonathan Pollack, a Senior Fellow at the Center for East Asian Policy and the Brookings Institution. Welcome. And also joining us at Kuala Lumpur is Yi Sun-oh, who is an Adjunct Senior Fellow from the Nanyang Technological University. We have a very strong panel. I want to welcome the four of you, gentlemen. The very first question, after the sanction, this new round being announced, okay, where is the ball? The ball is in whose court? Let's go to Mr. Pollack.
Well, good evening, Chen Wei. I think we need to be very, very careful about the terminology we use. When we use the term negotiation, that presumes that we're going back into some kind of a formal process with North Korea, whether bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, whatever, and we're not at that point. The issue here is whether or not some kind of contact is possible. In fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, of course, just met with Lee Young-ho, his counterpart from North Korea, in Manila. And that may be more the operative question. But what is significant, obviously, is that there is an effort here to get unanimous consent. Still a lot to be determined, but things that impose real costs on Pyongyang if they are if the sanctions are fully implemented.
We do see interactions among the foreign ministers. Professor Sun, Professor Lee rather, there is North Korea, South Korea foreign ministers even, and of course Chinese and North Koreans, not to mention South Koreans and the United States. But will these interactions eventually lead to what Mr. Pollack just mentioned, a possibility of real negotiation? That is a big question mark, isn't it?
You just mentioned several countries, all big countries with considerable political gravitas in world affairs, and then you have tiny, somewhat backward, impoverished North Korea. North Korea, which sees itself as the party wielding the proverbial carrot and stick. The ball is always in North Korea's court, as far as I can see, looking at the past 25 years of nuclear diplomacy and the latest UN Security Council resolution. One thorny question arises, which is, what is the life expectancy of nuclear diplomacy and UN Security Council resolutions? In my view, UN Security Council resolutions are somewhat like an individual's New Year resolution. At first, there's great fervor, full compliance even, but after a while, lethargy sets in, non-compliance followed by even blatant violation, and the problem grows. So will this latest toughly worded UN Security Council resolution make any difference, have a positive impact anytime soon?
Right.
It's too soon to tell, but I would say probably not.
Professor Lee always gives us some very interesting analogies, including this time. But of course, this is more frequent, it seems, UN Security Council resolution than the New Year resolution that you just talked about. Let's go to Mr. Zhao for that. So, are we just postponing the realizing moment that we have to do something, and we have to do it without any condition among all parties? Or are we really enjoying ourselves at this point about, the overall unanimous voting for a UN Security Council resolution against the DPRK? Mr. Zhao, from China's perspective.
Right, I think this time is a little different. The new sanctions resolution is not only about words, it does have teeth. It categorically prohibits exports from North Korea of important mineral resources and fishing, etc. That will cut North Korea's overall foreign income by 1/3. So that is going to seriously undermine North Korea's economic health.
If we know the number were correct. I mean,
Right.
3 billion was the number that we assumed that the DPRK has in terms of international trade, and 1/3 would be $1 billion US.
Yeah, and another difference from previous resolutions is that it does not include livelihood loophole, to use the word. So there is no room for so-called flexible interpretation. So it will be, I think, less likely for countries to have disputes about whether the sanctions have been faithfully implemented.
Yeah.
So I think it is going to have a real impact. The issue is countries currently differ about how much they can go in this direction further without destabilizing the North Korean economic system and therefore the political system. The Chinese position is always that we should avoid directly threatening the stability of the regime. the U.S. is more than happy to see the economic sanctions taking an incremental approach to undermine the regime.
Let's go to another guest before we talk about the China and the U.S. side of it, because there are many bilateral and triangle relationships we're talking about here. Mr. Oh from the Nanyang Technological University, of course, it's amazing that the foreign ministers from all these countries could gather at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. This is such an important platform for this issue. But you have heard from the DPRK after the UN Security Council resolution that it is not, quote, going to put the nuclear weapon issue on the negotiating table, end of quote. So, Mr. Oh, from your perspective, how much danger are we facing right now?
Well, I think during all these years, North Korea has been bent on building their own nuclear weapons. I think they have seen from other examples around the world, once you are in possession of, shall we say, workable nuclear weapons, then the other countries would treat you differently, or in North Korea's opinion, treat you with more respect. So we have seen all these rounds and rounds of sanctions of United Nations Security Council resolutions being passed, and then they might take effect for a short number of time, a short span of time, depending on the willingness of the various UN countries to members to enforce these resolutions. But typically you would go back to square one. North Korea would start testing new, for example, ICBMs in this case, and you would like to impose new sanctions, but it has never been really working.
Mr. Polak, Chinese side, according to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, said very clearly, once again, call on all parties to keep calm. But at the same time, we do hear from the U.S. Secretary of State Tillerson talking about the timing of possible negotiation or interaction with DPRK. He said, we will know it when we see it. They're vague in a way about the timing. So, Mr. Polak, do you think it is a statement made out of frustration because there's no solution? Or is it a statement out of, in fact, not even a little bit of strategy at all?
I think Secretary of State Tillerson has probably leaned farther forward than anyone else in the administration, the Trump administration at this point, not so much on the idea of negotiations again, but of talks, on specific talks as to format, context, and when. That's worthy of note. He's in effect saying to North Korea, you need to do some things, or rather cease to do certain things, and the United States would take that as a possible signal or indicator of whether the atmosphere might permit at least discussions with North Korea. So I think that's a fairly direct signal from Secretary Tillerson. Again, and his statements in a variety of contexts have actually been praised by Chinese officials and the like. But the question is always: does this really reflect a true center of gravity in the Trump administration and a way ahead? And I think on that, frankly, we have to see, because again, he's being quite explicit. Cessation of missile testing, all missile testing presumably, would be the minimum requirement before the United States would think about any next steps.
Right. Secretary Tillerson did talk about the signs, that is to stop the missile tests. He didn't mention about nuclear. He said stop the missile test. But Mr. Polak, if I could mention
right, there has been no. It's worthy of note. Yeah.
Yes, it is worthy of note. But on the other hand,
I'm just going to say, it's worthy of note that there has been no nuclear test now in almost a year.
That's true. Mr. Polak, what do you say when you use the word atmosphere? From Washington's perspective, if, let's just put yourself into the shoes of Secretary Tillerson, what exactly would be the atmosphere we are talking about here from the U.S. perspective? Give us some factors that would make up so-called atmosphere.
Well, I mean, the most important dimension of what's just happened is the very fact that it was a unanimous UNSC resolution. All members, permanent and otherwise, on the Security Council, preserving that idea that there is a common position on this, if you will. It's the Security Council and
a common position.
Others all against North Korea. North Korea, of course, in its initial response just a few hours ago, has, of course, not surprisingly, been sharply defiant. In fact, it's very interesting to me that there were 2 or 3 quite specific references criticizing China in North Korea's response. So I think North Korea, in some sense, feels a bit more heat here, but I don't think that they see this as something that requires them to immediately retrench and talk about a different policy.
But you know,
and frankly, North Korea will probably continue to test when they feel the need to
Mr. Polak, let me just do it again, because I'm asking about the U.S. What do you consider as so-called atmosphere? Let's just not assume anything about DPRK. You said common consensus.
Okay.
That's been reached. Okay, what else are the atmosphere that you're talking about?
Well, atmosphere was the word that I used. I don't know that Secretary Tillerson used it as
what would
such.
you make up your interpretation?
What the U.S. is but in my own view, there are some in the administration who feel that there is a basis on which you can defer any possible, if you will, a reckoning here. Nobody wants to see a war. There have been some noises, some signals from some parts of the administration that we have to consider all options, but I don't think we are at that point. But the question is the direction of policy and the direction of various activities on the part of all affected states, but particularly looking for signs from North Korea. But again, the United States, to judge by the comments from President Trump, it feels that there is a basis on which the U.S. can mobilize forces to make clear to North Korea the costs of sustaining its weapons program before any real consideration could be given for an alternative direction in U.S. policy.
Okay. Mr. Polak was also talking about domestic consensus in a way. Mr. Zhao, that is exactly the question I want to put to you. There are countries, United States, South Korea, China, I guess, also included, debates going on in the society, certainly among policymakers, about what to do with this. And there seems to be getting divergently very different views even within our own societies. So what would this mean eventually for a final policy decision for the governments of these countries regarding this? Mr. Zhao.
Well, it certainly means that homework should be done in every country. Given the sharp division in many of the key players in the region. You have mentioned the United States. There were very different voices from CIA director, from the vice president, from the state secretary. So that sends very mixed signal to North Korea. It doesn't help reassuring the North Koreans. In South Korea, for example, there were deep divisions between the Progressive Party and the more conservative parties. They have fundamental different assumptions about the motivation of North Korean nuclear program, about what to do with it going forward.
That is just facts. I'm asking you what might be the impact of this policy, very sharp policy differences on the eventual policy decision-making process.
Well, the impact is it really prevents countries from engaging substantively with each other. Countries have difficulty even understanding their own national strategy, let alone to have an accurate understanding about each other's strategy. One reason China has been reluctant to impose more pressure is because China really doesn't understand the logic of American policy of posing more economic pressure. So we have to do more homework in order to better promote mutual understanding.
Okay, if I could just follow up very briefly to you as well. You know, this is only temporary. UN resolution until another test. Hopefully the other side wouldn't, but we don't know. So what is China going to do? Is China going to be, Mr. Zhao, as some of the Chinese here in our society complaining about, forever pressured by the United States for something that is done wrongly by the DPRK?
I think for the U.S. to further press China to resolve North Korea crisis is going into a dead end. There's really nothing more significantly for China to do. China has already cut all major economic relations with North Korea. I think we are reaching a point where U.S. has to reflect upon its own strategy. The only option seems to be that engaging with North Korea is the most effective approach to diffuse the tension and to open the door for having a near-term agreement.
Of course, that's what the DPRK wants, to have engagement. But of course, the U.S. has its own conditions, as I said. Let's go to Professor Lee. You know, China, South Korea, even though you are based in the United States, but still you do a lot of research about South Korea, have these ultimate differences as well. Even though the two countries are agreeing with one another, there should be engagement, but there is the THAAD system, and South Korea has promised the United States to fully implement, deploy the whole overall THAAD system. That's going to be a violation of China's, what they consider as its rights and also a sovereignty issue. So, Professor Lee, what do you think about these dramatically different opinions on something important among these countries, between South Korea and China, for example? Will things get worse?
You know, in Asian culture, of course, atmosphere or atmospherics are very important, and Chairman Mao mentioned in 1968 and 1969 when Richard Nixon, campaigning for the presidency and upon becoming president, would say that he wants to bring China out of its isolation into the international community. Chairman Mao was dismissive and said that that's just atmospherics. Atmospherics changed to substance when there emerged a common interest, namely in the form of the common threat of the Soviet Union, which paved the way for talks between China and the United States. From South Korea's point of view, from a nationalistic point of view, THAAD is essential, not in deterring North Korea's ICBM launches, but in North Korea's short-range and mid-range launches. From China's point of view, THAAD is anathema because apparently THAAD can enable South Korea and the US to monitor activities inside China. There is no convergence yet of national interest between South Korea and China on the issue of THAAD, or even North Korea. That will happen only when the carrying cost of continuing to support North Korea for Seoul and Beijing becomes just too costly. Only when the US sees North Korea as an imminent critical threat and is willing to either abandon South Korea or take military action risking war, only then will there be any change. For now, it will be the same old story of North Korean provocations, negotiations and concessions. And as you just now mentioned, yes, there will be another provocation, maybe a nuclear test, another ICBM test, and then what? Have another UN Security Council resolution? These resolutions are tough on paper, but they're not self-executing. Nation states have to fully implement them, and that's very hard. So in the short term, North Korea will remain undeterred.
I see. Mr. Oh, before we go, about 30 seconds left for you. This is taking place in such an unusual platform, ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. What do you think this said about the parties' reluctance to look at each other and talk to one another, and yet eventually come together?
Well, I think the North Korea issue has never been really a serious concern for ASEAN, simply because of the distance, the long distance between North Korea and these countries. But I also don't think all these sort of preconditions and good atmosphere and so on, I don't think they are realistic in terms of expecting North Korea to accede to them, because I think North Korea is really bent on building their own nuclear weapons and deployable nuclear weapons. So either you give them some sort of incentive for abandoning doing so, for example, some sort of economic engagement, or you let them proceed with the deployment of such nuclear weapons, or you have to engage in war. So you need to make clear choices. You cannot be ambiguous about it, whether it's peace or war, or you let them go forward.
Well said. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the four of you. I have a very strong panel. I wish I had another 20 minutes to explore all these important topics. For now, we have to wrap it up. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Zhao Tong, Jonathan Pollack, Yi Sam-ho, and last but certainly not least, Sun Young Lee. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Still to come on our program. Trump has raised the potential of a China-U.S. trade war by threatening China with tariffs in response to alleged intellectual property theft. Will this action really boost the U.S. employment and lower the trade surplus? We're going to ask those questions. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Trade tensions between China and the U.S. are rising to a worrying situation. Multiple press reports suggested that the White House will launch tough new trade actions against China. And this time, an old trade weapon that has not been used since the establishment of the WTO may be triggered, potentially leading to a comprehensive trade war between the world's largest economies.
Another attempt to reduce the trade deficit with China. This time, President Trump is using a double-edged sword. Washington is set to preparing measures targeting China on intellectual property theft, on rules that require foreign companies to share technology to access the Chinese market. The White House could use an old provision in U.S. trade law to investigate these practices and levy penalties. The policy known as Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows the president to impose tariffs and protect the U.S. from unfair trading practices. The procedure has not been used since the establishment of the WTO in 1995. After that year, most trade disputes were processed through the WTO. Yet, Trump is different from his predecessors.
This is an administration that doesn't have a lot of patience. Right? So they are not going to, they don't want to sit around. They want results yesterday. So I think that's why we're seeing this.
Beijing is already calling fall and pledging retaliation.
I want to emphasize that the Chinese government attaches great importance to the protection of international property rights, and our success is there for all to see. Any trade measures taken out by a member of the World Trade Organization should all respect the WTO's rules. We have always considered China-U.S. trade relations to be the bedrock of China-U.S. bilateral relations.
Though Section 301 allows the U.S. president to take unilateral trade action against other countries, the WTO has stressed that taking such action against other WTO member countries without first securing approval violates the WTO agreement. Since June, Trump has soured on China-U.S. relations, accusing Beijing of not reining in the DPRK missile development. Last week, he tweeted, "I am very disappointed in China. Our foolish past leaders have allowed them to make hundreds of billions of dollars a year on trade. Yet, they did nothing for us with North Korea, just talk." China has, for a long time, called the DPRK and the U.S. to stop intensifying the situation, yet neither side is willing to give in.
War on China-U.S. trade dispute. We are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhang Jianping, Director General of the China Center for Regional Cooperation at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., we are joined by Charles Freeman, who is the Managing Director at the Bauer Group Asia and former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs. Welcome as well. Want to begin with you, Mr. Freeman. Of course, in your professional career, you've seen these kind of debates over and over and over again. Is this time going to be different from the previous times?
It might be. I think what we've got in President Trump and some of his trade advisors, we've got a group of people that really doesn't value the WTO and the international trade regime as much as predecessors may have. And indeed, you have open calls for a return to sort of the more unilateral efforts of the era before WTO, using things like 301. So it could very well be different.
Mr. Zhang, what does China make of the use of 301? Some suggest this is already a very old kind of way of thinking about international trade and also thinking about the future of bilateral relations.
Yes, you know that as an expert in this field, I feel amazing on that because, you know, in the past decades. Before 1990s, U.S. did use this type of measures, but since the WTO established, U.S. was rare to do like this. But I'm afraid that this special, Section 301, which is will focusing on intellectual property issues, as well as IP, market access issues. In case they use this type of domestic laws, that maybe there will be contradiction between their domestic law and international law. So how to explain it and how to operate it? So I'm afraid that the U.S. will get into trouble on that.
Well, Mr. Zhang, probably you're already one step ahead than some of the advisors for President Trump in that regard. Let's go to Mr. Freeman to help us understand, what's next? If U.S. take another step, try to punish China on that, it's likely to violate some of the rules of the international trade mechanism. And then how will the U.S. still remain in that mechanism and do business with others, even with China on different issues?
Well, I think the Trump administration is trying to be a little strategic in this, and they're using a section of the 301 law that allows the United States to take unilateral action if there is an issue not covered by the WTO. And in this case, the theory would be that the forced technology transfer through intellectual property rights co-option or something of that sort is not covered by WTO, and therefore this would not be an illegal unilateral action. I think that's easily challenged, and I also know that there are possibilities that China could take unilateral action of its own in retaliation, and that could put us down the path of a very difficult trade skirmish, if not all-out war.
Okay. Mr. Zhang, let's go to the root of this. Is there or are there many cases of so-called forced intellectual property transfer from outside China to China demanded by China? Mr. Zhang.
I think that nowadays between China has been a big player in international markets. Also, IP enter China, and China's IP go to other countries already very frequent. So in this regard, I think that technology transfer and IP deals often happened many times. In this regard, especially today, we are at age of globalization. Actually, every country needs to cooperate with other countries. That means we need to have more and more frequent, IP deals, trade deal with other economy. So meanwhile, also we need to cooperate together.
Mr. Freeman, agree or not?
No, I think that's generally right. I think the problem is that while at this point I don't think anybody in the United States government doubts the sincerity of the Ministry of Commerce or others in the Chinese government that value and support the protection of intellectual property. The reality is that intellectual property theft and co-option is continues in a pretty dramatic scale in China, and how you deal with that is a subject that both Chinese and U.S. negotiators are really tearing their hair out and have been for years. This may not be the preferred route for anyone to go a unilateral direction of taking on the Chinese, but Chinese on this side. But that it is born out of a little frustration, and I think that's understandable.
Is China taking any actions, really functional actions against the IPR theft and also cooperation?
I think that in China, that China's market economy only have 4 decades, so very young markets. In that progress, from Chinese side, gradually we have formulated our rules and regulations on IPR. Also, every year, China's State Bureau of IPR did a lot and in order to protect IP. Especially, I emphasize on one sentence, that is, given that China needs to have our innovation-oriented economy, that means by ourselves we have to protect IPR.
I see. Mr. Freeman, you are a frequenter to China. So is what Mr. Zhang from China just described part of the pictures you saw?
Of course, and I think you've seen dramatic improvements in both protection and enforcement of intellectual property in China over the past 4 decades. There's no doubt. I mean, it used to be you'd talk about intellectual property with Chinese entrepreneurs, and they'd say, "Why should we not use Microsoft Windows for free when the rest of the world has used gunpowder, paper, and other things that the Chinese, China came up with and never received licensing fees or royalties for?" I think that's changed a lot over the years. But the reality continues to be that intellectual property theft, is still a major issue in China, and although one recognizes that this is only a 4-decade-old experiment in the development of the Chinese economy since the mid-70s, you also have China has become the world's largest trading economy, probably, and it will certainly be the largest economy pretty soon. So it may not be enough of an excuse to say we're still new at this when you're the biggest player in the field.
You're not new anymore, Mr. Zhang, according to Mr. Freeman. Meanwhile, China, Made in China 2025, China considers it as a very important way of making its own manufacturing to be global. However, others consider it, at least some of them, see China as trying to be on its own. Mr. Zhang, what do you make of all of these, reactions from the others, and also assessment, whether true or not, from the others?
I think that Made in 2025 will not only for China itself, but also for global markets.
Explain.
Yeah. Today China is the second biggest economy in the world, the biggest manufacturing center in the world, the biggest traders in the world. So that means China's manufacturing sectors belonging to all over the world. In that progress, actually, every year China exported so a lot of products, and we provided our affordable products for those developing countries, also developing. In the future, in case we can have our, technology, high value added products, qualified products, and then, every country can benefit from that. Of course, for China, in the future, gradually we will be moving on, medium end at the high end of manufacturing sectors, and some of, low end manufacturing chains may be gradually moving to other, poor countries and least developing countries.
All right. There's another question I should also ask you, Mr. Freeman, because we asked the Chinese guys, quite a number of them, for him to fight back, but for you as well. I mean, the United States tried to exercise Section 301, of course, with the name of intellectual property rights protection. But the link that the U.S. policymakers these days are trying to make between politics, geopolitics, and trade, and also the use of seldomly exercised sections of international law, which has been outdated in a way. What would that mean eventually for the U.S. soft power, if I could use that very abstract and big word? And what would that mean for the U.S. reputation when it comes to international trade? And how will the U.S. react, really, if China take retaliatory actions after the U.S. took something China wouldn't accept?
That's a profound question, Tianwei, and I think it's hard to answer. The reality is that soft power comes out of other countries looking at the United States and seeing something they'd like to emulate. And when the United States quite officially goes forth and says, we are just about making America great again and to heck with everybody else, that's hard to preserve good feelings and soft power when that's a primary focus of your administration, whether it's in trade or other international affairs. So I do think this is not something the United States can do blithely, and I do think that this might actually make China, in its efforts to develop its own soft power with other countries, look better. So I'm not sure that this gets us to a place that even Mr. Trump would agree is making America great again.
I see. Before we go, 30 seconds left for you, Mr. Zhang. What can China do now?
Firstly, I think that we have to convince the U.S. to understand, trade surplus issues. Secondly, also we need to have more dialogue with the U.S.
Good luck with that, Mr. Zhang.
Yeah.
Mr. Freeman participated in many of those sessions. Anyway, and then secondly, you said?
Yeah, secondly, we have to promote dialogue and even if negotiations. Third one, from Chinese side, we will take positive measures to import more and more products made in the U.S.
And in other countries as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Zhang Jianping, Charles Freeman. Good luck to all of the things that you guys have been doing. I think it would be great if policymakers would go the way that you guys have been thinking. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight, CGTN on your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. We got a YouTube channel over there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo. Find us anywhere in the world. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone else on World Insight with Tian Wei team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.